Hello, and welcome to another episode of FPC Talks. Thank you for tuning in, and I really think you will enjoy our program today. Our very special guest is a longtime member of First Presbyterian. This is Mary Tonnesen. Not only has Mrs. Tonnesen been a member of FPC for many years, but her family heritage also has deep roots in our church, as it was that some of her ancestors were original founding members of FPC back in the 1830s. Mrs. Tonnesen herself has been an active participant in the life of the church throughout her life. She's graciously agreed to be on our program to share memories and recount some of her family history. Mrs. Tonnesen, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm very glad to be here.
So there's a roster of the 18 original members of the Burlington Church. Now, the Burlington Church was the predecessor to First Presbyterian Church of Huntington. But among the names listed were one James and one Martha Johnston. How are you related?
Well, James and Martha Johnston are my great-grandparents. Great-great-grandparents, I'm sorry.
Yes.
And they, the story goes, can I tell the story?
Of course, please.
That they were living in County Antrim, Ireland. And originally, I think some of their ancestors had been from Scotland, and evidently they were facing some hard times there. And because of Ireland being primarily Catholic, the Protestants were sometimes not treated very well. So they decided, James and Martha were married in 1817, and they and some of their family decided that they would move to America. And it was a long, hard trip, but they arrived in Canada, and then they moved from Canada to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then in 1820, they came down the river, Ohio River, on a flatboat. I'm not sure how many there were, but the story is told that their son, are you ready for this?
Yes,
their
sure,
son William,
sure.
I don't need to say that. Their son William was born on the flatboat while they were coming down the Ohio River.
That's incredible.
Now, whether he would be considered from Ohio or Virginia, because it was not yet West Virginia at that time, I think some of the family stayed in Burlington, and some settled on the West Virginia side, and they were able to purchase some land in the west end of Huntington, more around between 5th and 9th Street West now. And I understand they built several smaller homes, but then sometime in the middle of the 19th century, they built this farmhouse, which is still standing today. Yeah,
it is.
Mm-hmm.
And well, is that? Do you have a where that's located?
Oh, yes. Well, it's on the corner of 7th Street and 7th Street West and Jefferson Avenue.
Wow. So thank you for sharing that, by the way, about the origins. Do you have any stories? Do you remember hearing anything about the church? The Burlington Church, and then on into when they started meeting at Marshall Academy.
Well, yes, when they first came down there, they would get in boats, and they would, because there was a church in Burlington, a Presbyterian church, they would get in boats on Sunday and get over to Burlington, and it was a all-day event, and they would take their dinner with them and picnic in baskets and worship in the Burlington church. After a while, they decided that they really would like to have a church on their own side that they could, without having to make that day-long trip. And at the same time, some folks, I understand they were from Guyandotte at that time, but of course Guyandotte was older than Huntington, that they would like an education institution on the college level. So, both the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church decided and offered that they would contribute generously to the Marshall Academy if they would let them use their facilities. So they made that arrangement, and then for a while they met alternately. The Methodists met one Sunday, and the Presbyterians the next, in whatever facilities they had at that time. And later they decided they wanted to build a church of their own. So. You have another question, or shall I go on?
No, that's great. You can go on. I wanted to maybe ask you more about your grandparents, and we're going to talk a little bit about your grandfather and your father as well as architects, but just in general, what were your grandparents like? And you were named after your grandmother, you said, Mary.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid I can't tell you too much what my grandparents were like. My grandfather, well, my grandmother, Mary, was the daughter of William Johnston, and the one that was born on the flatboat. She and Robert Day was also, their family, the Day family came over even before they came over before the Johnston family, but they were more in Pennsylvania and New York area. And Robert had, well, one interesting thing about Robert was that his parents were living, and he was living with them, of course, in the Georgia, down in the state of Georgia. And when the Civil War came, before they told them that they could stay with and have their jewelry business if they would pledge allegiance to the Confederate flag, to the Confederacy. And they refused to do that. So they lost their business, their whole business. But he moved back up, and the family settled in think Livonia, New York. And that's where Robert had his schooling. And then he became a teacher for 5 years. And then he had a cousin that was working on the railroad. And he became a surveyor and moved down to Virginia, and it seemed that he liked the city, what was here in Huntington. It was in eastern Kentucky, and that's where he met my grandmother, Mary Martha Johnston, and they got married, and they lived in this house on 64 West 6th Avenue. It was a red brick house. And later, my father sold that land to the where the Kamak Children's Center is.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, my grandfather, I was born in 1926 in January, which makes me 95 years old now. And I never thought I would live that long, but here I am. And it seems that he was out mowing lawn on a hot July day and had a heart attack in 1928. So I was too young to remember anything about him. And I should remember more about my grandmother, but I really don't. Mm-hmm. And she continued to live there. Along with my dad, and no, I'm not sure. But anyway, the Dawson family was quite active in this church too, and
that's Bill Dawson. Is that the family?
Yeah. And Cora, that's Bill's mother. She had lost her mother, and there were a number of children, and the father had them go to different places. And Dad had lost an infant. His only sister he had was Flossie, and she died in infancy. So they were ready to take in a child, a daughter especially, since they'd lost one. And she came to live with them and grew up just like a sister to my father, Cora Dawson.
Wow.
Cora later married Daniel Dawson, and he was very active here in the church as clerk of session for many years, and then Bill became treasurer, one of their children. And my cousin Mary, we were just 2 days apart in our birth. She became a director of Christian education.
You said your cousin Mary?
Yeah, my cousin
Mary.
Bill's sister.
Yeah.
Bill Dawson's younger sister.
I see.
I'm getting off the track.
Yeah, no, that's great.
But anyway, she grew up with my grandmother in the same house. So she remembers a lot more about her than I do. But I mean, she was a Christian lady, attended church, was active in the women's work. I know all that about her, but as to her personality, I really don't.
Yeah, sure.
I've talked enough.
That's great. No, I appreciate that. So, the next question is about your grandfather and father, Robert and Sidney Day, which there's a collection. This is kind of a side note, but there's a collection of his papers. And your father was one of the architects, the design, a very prominent architect in the city of Huntington, and designed many buildings in and around Huntington. I suppose your grandfather did as well, but Sidney is your father. He even designed the house that you grew up in down there on Jefferson
That's
Avenue.
correct.
Yeah. And just to name a few of the buildings, I got this from the web, the Miller and Ritter building, which says the corner of 10th Street and 4th Avenue. I'll ask you in a minute about that one. The Huntington Publishing Company, so this was the Herald Dispatch, or at least the original part of the Herald Dispatch building before they did some additions. Height Saunders Elementary.
Well, I think he did the one on 10th Street and 5th Avenue. Too.
That's okay, yeah.
But there was an earlier building on.
An earlier building, yeah.
On 5th Avenue too.
Okay. And many churches around, Beverly Hills Presbyterian, Highland Presbyterian, Coon Memorial, Foster Memorial Home. So, and he did that for as long as you can remember. And he went to the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute.
That's right. He had a scholarship there, and so that's how he was able to go. Before that, he had gone to Marshall, like 2 years, whatever they had at that time.
Before you were born.
And my grandmother attended Marshall too.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. And the Sunday school building that is the next door, we're going to talk about in here too, the chancel area, but the Sunday school building next door. Can you tell us a little more about your parents, your father and your mother?
Oh, well, my father was a wonderful man. I was very fortunate to have such a good father. And he was not a show off or anything. I mean, he was not one big in society, but he was quiet, but he was a hard worker. He was very generous to the church. He served as an officer here, as a deacon and an elder. And I know some of the people that worked for him, they told me that they respected him so much because he had so much integrity. So, now Mother grew up in Georgetown, Ohio. And the interesting thing about it is that Mother's aunt, Lyda Johnston, lived here in the house on 12th Street and 6th Avenue. And she was married to James Johnston, who was an uncle of my dad's.
Oh, okay.
So that's how they met. And they weren't blood related, but they were,
yeah.
They had that family resemblance. And she was 10 years younger than Dad. Mother attended. I remember coming to church with Mother and Dad when I was young, and we sat up in the balcony right up there.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I should show I always like to show the whole, yeah, so you'll, yeah.
And she was a Christian lady, and but she had some health problems, and some things that they weren't, maybe today they could help her with more than at the time, but so she wasn't as active as my dad was, but she did take part in the women's work and the circles and circle and all that. And then my sister Catherine was, let me tell you, before they got married, I think my father had taken this house that I told you about on 7th Street in Jefferson, mm-hmm. and he had made it into a duplex, two upstairs and downstairs. So that's where they moved into the upstairs apartment after they were married. And then it was next to that, on the lot right next to it, where my house that I grew up in was built in 25, I think, and they moved into it in 26, I think.
Okay. Yeah. And he designed the chancel up here that I'm going to show some pictures of these medallions. We were trying to find a good close-up picture, and I'm sure there are some that exist, but this area that we're sitting in right now was actually a lot different. I'm not here to, I may show a picture of that. I'll show a picture of that, but the area here was renovated about 12 or so years ago. But this pulpit right here, and we were just talking about that too. He designed the intricate woodwork. Now he didn't do the woodwork, you said, but he did come up with the plans and the design to do that.
Around 1930, I think.
Yeah, and you said the name here on this plaque, George, Mrs. Caldwell. So George Jackson Caldwell by his wife and daughters, in the loving memory of George Jackson Caldwell by his wife and daughters. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me again maybe what we were just talking about that Mrs. Caldwell had asked your father?
Well, I wasn't at the time, but
you were an infant.
But the Caldwells were a very prominent family here in Huntington, and there were several Caldwells, so they're mixed up. But she just wanted to give something, or maybe to do something in memory and in honor, and so she asked my father to design a pulpit. I guess that was what she wanted to do. So he came up with a design. And whether he actually designed it or whether he got it from some architectural magazine or something, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But,
sure.
But they do have his name in there.
Yeah.
And some people think he also designed this, what you're calling medallion.
Yeah, these.
But I think the same thing was probably true for that.
Uh-huh.
He was not. Some people think he actually did that, like John Anderson was doing. I said no.
That he sat there with a pocket knife and carved.
He wasn't a woodworker. He wasn't a woodworker. He was an architect.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the some of what church was like when you were very young. You before the Sunday school building was built, you had Sunday school, and I mean when you were very young, you had Sunday school in the house that was next door. There was some sort of house next door.
Yes, there was a house next door, and the cradle roll or nursery was on the second floor. And I thought later, well, that wasn't very practical with it, but you had to go up these stairs. But I don't really remember that at that age, but I remember it from a later age, yes.
I think I can show a little picture here. We're gonna bring up some more pictures later, but just to the, if you're looking at the picture to the left is the house. Yeah.
And then on the, I'm sorry, my voice.
Oh, that's okay.
I'll get it. The house on this main floor.
Mm-hmm.
That was where we had the beginners department, what they called before. It was for 4 and 5 years old, and I'm not sure whether the 3-year-olds were in there or not, or just 4. And that's where Miss Jenny Wood was. So she taught there for many years. She taught in the public schools. She was just a very well-loved person.
I think I have the picture here, yeah.
And evidently could keep the children's attention, and as I recall, we would sit in a semicircle and she would tell a story. And they said she was a master storyteller. And I do remember singing "Jesus Loves Me"
Yeah.
in that department. And maybe someone reminded me of that today. Praise him, all ye little children. Yes, God is love. God is love.
What was the youth program like later when you were in high school? And once you and you said your Catherine was 3 years older, so I guess when you were teenagers.
Have I got time to tell you about the other?
Yeah, of course.
After
please.
after the beginners was primary.
And, between the
the primary, and I don't remember too much about the primary, except that I know we got these little papers that always had a Bible story and had a picture on the front and the Bible story on the side. And we did a lot of handwork or coloring and made things. And then in the intermediate department, junior came next, and that was held up in the round, what we call the round room or the chapel today. We had these little smaller rooms all around in the back. And that's where we would go for our lesson. And Mr. Lowance, a very active church member here, an officer, and the father of Lady Lou Jenkins, that some people remember. He was the superintendent of that department. And we would have a little worship service, and then we would go to the rooms for a lesson. And then when I was in intermediate, we called it the intermediate department back then. It was like for junior high age. And the thing I remember most about that department was that two of our teachers or leaders were Mr. Henry and Mr. Moorhead, both of which sang in the choir. So when we were in the intermediate department, we did a lot of singing. And one of the songs, we had favorites that we sang. I think they sort of let us maybe pick them out, hold up our hand and suggest it. Love lifted me. So whenever we sang Love Lifted Me, we stood up and then we would sit down again. Love lifted me, and we would go. Those are things that I remember. Mm-hmm. After that was senior high, and I think we followed more or less the printed matter that the General Assembly or the churches as a whole distributed. And I don't seem to have as many remembrances about what we actually did in that department, but we did have meetings in the evening. We had senior high meetings. In fact, we did for both intermediate and both junior high and senior high, in which we would have a program, and then we had they gave us a little supper, usually hot dogs.
Was it down in the basement here?
Yes, yeah. That's where we went. That's not where we had our meeting, but it's where we went for the supper, yeah. Mm-hmm. And usually hot dogs and potato chips and Coca-Cola or something, some other soft drink. I think occasionally we might have a hamburger or some other kind of sandwich, but it was a wonderful time, though. I really enjoyed all of it, and I was very faithful. Both my sister and I were very faithful to come to all the Sunday school and youth meetings. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was getting ready to bring up, here's the picture we talked about, and your sister's in this, Catherine's in this picture, but it's hard to see, and it's hard probably for the people watching to see, but it's also quite hard to see. It's an old newspaper clipping. But this says that this class is from 1939 to leave early in the morning for Lewisburg, where they will attend the annual Young People's Conference. And you said you could speak maybe not about Catherine going, but you attended the Young People's Conference also. And what was that about?
Well, first, when I was in junior high, we had a church camp out that I went to. I loved the church camps. Yes, it was held where the Campfire Girls camp was later on in the year, which belonged to them. And they were always a lot of fun and also inspirational. But we went up to Greenbrier Military School when we were in high school. And we always had a good group going. We would have vespers in the evening with a really good speaker, and we had competition between, we had Indian names. Camp was sort of divided into that. Mm-hmm. So there would be competition, some sports, and Catherine and I both thoroughly enjoyed those youth conferences.
You moved, after high school, you moved away for a little while.
No, after college.
After college, right. After college.
I went 4 years to Marshall.
You went to Marshall, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Well, we had at that particular time, there was a great emphasis in our church on going into full-time Christian service. And according to the Presbytery book that we were talking about, there were, at one time there were 35 from our church that went into some form of Christian service, full-time. Mm-hmm. So I had Mary Dawson, as I said, she was one that went into that, and Arlene Kelly, or Woods, she grew up as Arlene Woods. I don't know whether anybody remembers her. She went as a missionary to Japan.
I remember her. She came to my school when I was in the second grade and talked about Japan to my second grade class. Yeah.
So, I mean, some became ministers. Quite a number became ministers. So I was considering that too. Not to become a minister, but to become a director of Christian education. But I wasn't, for one thing, I wasn't musical at all. I mean, I enjoyed music, but I just don't have an ear for it. So I thought that was a drawback, but, and I guess there were some other reasons. So I was a counselor out at the church camp at that time, where we were having it at Camp Logan. I did that several years when I was in college, and the minister there, Joseph Ledford, was pastor at the Second Presbyterian Church in Huntington here, which was a much more active church then than it is now. But
and this was next door to your house, or near
a couple blocks.
A couple blocks down.
9th Street West, yeah. Mm-hmm. So anyway, he asked, I sort of took some minutes for him up at church camp, and he asked me he was losing his secretary, and he asked me to become his church secretary, and told me that, there are different ways to serve, and that was a way that you could serve. just as well. So I decided to do that. But the thing was, I'd only worked there about 3 months when he got this call to Nashville, Tennessee. And he told me he'd like for me to come with him, but he'd have to, check with the church, So that's how I ended up down there in March of 1949. Right after I got out of college, I worked up at Marshall for a while in the offices, which I'd done as a student assistant. So I went to Nashville. And the church there is interesting. It was the name of Woodland Presbyterian Church.
Oh.
So now I'm at the Woodlands Retirement Community. But it was a nice church. I stayed there 7 years. So I got married, moved to Portland, Oregon, because that's where my husband was from. He was in the Army when I met him, and we were there 16 years, but my marriage broke up. I won't go into all that. But we attended church all the time. We did attend church. But, Baptist, I was immersed, and we became a Baptist for a while.
Yeah, that's great.
But anyway, we came back, and it was like coming home. It was coming back to this church was just like coming home, and my children didn't seem to mind that much that we moved all the way back here. And so we all joined the church here, and what were we going to talk about?
Well, yeah, and I was getting ready to bring up too, because you said you returned, and you said that was 1972. You told me. It made me think of something actually when you were talking about moving back here. You had visited throughout the years. Your children were a little familiar with Huntington, or they knew.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
When you returned, you became very active again. Once again, once you got back here, and you taught Sunday school. I have that picture that I'm going to pull up that I found of you with what age group of children are around?
Oh, I taught the 4th graders, 9 years old. And
I bet there's some people who are watching this who probably recognize themselves. Someone told me once who some of those kids were in that picture. This is from about the period of the 70s?
I can't remember. I know.
Yeah.
I know Jack Borland was one of my students, and he's here in our church now. I was trying to think whether there were others. I'm sure there must be, but I don't know.
I could show that picture.
I enjoyed teaching, yes.
Yeah. This was the other. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I taught Sunday school for so many years, I can't remember. And then I became what they call the elementary chairman or something. And later I did secretarial work. But at some period, they gave me a certificate or honored me with over 30 years of service to the church school.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And that also made me think of something else that I just thought of, but there's the Sunday school certificate hanging in the hallway out here, but I think that's Catherine's. That's your sister's out here.
I think so, yeah. When she was growing up, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So I brought
all the time that I was active, Catherine was also, or maybe even more so.
yeah, that's the next thing. You and your sister were described by members in this church that you were known as God's angels. I guess you heard that before.
That's news to me.
News to you. You had a ministry.
That is news to me.
You visited a lot of sick and shut-ins and some ministered.
Oh, yes, we did. We visited about every Sunday afternoon. We visited, and used to have a lot of fresh flowers then, and we would mix these cans, these old juice cans, cover them and fill them with, and take them out to people on Sunday afternoon after church. Yeah. So, and of course we visited some other time too, but mostly Sunday afternoons is when we visited. Well, it was when I was still working. In the 80s, I became an officer, a deacon, and was made chairman of the carrying committee, so that was a part of that too. Mm-hmm. And we had an active ministry.
Organizing.
I did that for a long time.
Organizing some people together to help
make visits,
with the ministry.
Send cards, and just show people they were cared for. Yes.
That's wonderful. I was getting ready to ask if you could tell us some more about Catherine. We were talking about what you did together with. So.
Well, my sister was like 3 years older than I, and I became good friends with a lot of her friends too. She was a good person, and she, during the World War II, she went to Washington, D.C., and worked for the Army Signal Corps, decoding.
Oh, a decoder? Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, that was where she, but that was the only time she was away from Huntington in this church, and she loved this church like I do, and she was quite active in the women's work, and I think she and Mrs. Brewer were one of the first women deacons elected.
Really?
And they didn't used to have women.
Someone told me, I think when the General Assembly met here, and it must have been in the 40s or 50s, and that was the meeting here at this church where they decided to allow decided that women were equal. So she was one of the first. Wow.
And let's see. Well, mostly she was active as an officer in the women's work of the church, and I think she was working some in the Logos program too. Mm-hmm. After I retired, I was a docent up at the Huntington Museum of Art, and I decided that was enough at that time. So I didn't do the Logos. Mm-hmm. Though that's a good program, yeah.
Yeah.
And Catherine never married, but she was a big help to me when I moved back here. So since both of my parents had died, Dad died in '68, Mother in '70. And the house was given to both of us. We inherited it, Catherine and I. So we lived there together, and after my children left, we continued until she died. And I never thought that she would die before I was, because she always seemed healthier. But it's one of those things.
I remember you all always together, and that brings me to Bluestone again. You visited for many years. I remember you and Catherine always sit there with the puzzles.
Yes.
And when I was very young, we'd be running around, and come up, what are you all doing? Why are you doing puzzles? You're running around. But can you maybe tell us a little more about Bluestone?
Well, we loved Bluestone. Catherine, as I said, was here when it first opened, and I think she went every year before I came back. And then after I came back with the children, we went every year. And my son David not only went every year, he went to summer camp at Bluestone, and he always loved Bluestone. And then when he got older, he couldn't go to camp anymore. He became a counselor, and when he was in college, or maybe his senior year of high school, and so, and Carrie, his wife, since 2018, she grew up in this church, and she was 5 years younger than David, but they became friends at one of the Bluestone retreats, I remember. I mean, they knew each other anyway, but they became sort of interested in each other, and they finally got together to get married 2 years ago.
Oh.
But they got married at Bluestone, and because it had a lot of happy memories for them, and they thought it would be such fun to bring all their friends up there. They were living in Los Angeles, and they said it was as cheap to have a wedding at Bluestone for 2 or 3 days than it was to have a wedding in Los Angeles.
I bet. I bet.
But so we did. That's the one thing that we did special was working jigsaw puzzles.
Yeah.
Of course, we took part in the other activities.
Sure. Yeah.
And sometimes played other games at night.
The Bible studies.
Yeah, we all loved. My whole family loved Bluestone. Teresa was a counselor there. My oldest was a counselor there 1 year too.
Here's this picture that I was going to share, one of the last of my slideshow here, from the directory that's in the same archives over there in the library where your father's papers and the architecture papers of your father is in the special collections over at Marshall. This is from a photo album from a church directory. A lot of church members in that directory. I've had a chance to see that. Anyway, that's from our church records. So I just wanted to show that.
I think that was right after or soon after we moved back.
Right.
Anyway.
In the 70s, you said?
Well, let's see, I was baptized as an infant here by Dr. Mose, and my mother tells me that when he left, I was just about two or 3 years old when he left, that I cried because I didn't want him to leave. But then we had Dr. Belk and then Dr. Curry. Now, when I was in high school, and junior high, I guess, Dr. Armand Curry was our pastor, and he gave such good sermons and was a handsome fellow, so that a lot of the young people from other churches, or maybe not a lot, but at least some, would come over to our church.
Really? to listen. And he was, yeah.
And he did a few of these first-person sermons where, like the one that I especially remember was like he talked like when he was the innkeeper at Christ's birth. Mm-hmm. And he gave the whole sermon in the first person there. And they printed some of those. And then Dr. Bird came, and he was a very fine person. Some people say he prayed too long, but I don't remember that especially. but he was. They had a tragedy. They lost their little girl in
Really?
the first few years they were here.
Oh, no.
Well, I'm not sure how long they'd been here, but
How old was she? She very, very young.
she was young.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Just a year or two, I think, or a couple of years. I don't know.
Wow.
I didn't check that out. But what I do remember is that I wrote a poem.
Mm-hmm.
I used to write poetry some when I was younger about the red bird because she had red hair. She had red hair, and so I was over in their home a number of times when I was in college and immediately after. In fact, I think he thought I should still go to training school.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than take this job as a secretary.
Right. That's about it for the questions I have. I have this one last question. Just we didn't talk much about the current state of things and what was going on, but I just wondered, we've talked a lot about your history and your thoughts and your life. Do you have any comments on a vision of hope for the current generation and going into the future? Look, you know, a lot of people in the future will probably watch this, so we were talking about that a little bit. And if there's anything else that I've left out, but do you have any comments about hope for the current generation?
Yes. Well, of course, it's true everywhere. At least it's true in the Presbyterian churches, and I think a lot of the other churches do. That we don't begin to have the attendance like we used to have, like 2,000 members or something.
Right.
I don't really know, but you could probably check it out. In the 50s or 40s and 50s, those were the times. I hope the First Church will continue and after I'm gone and be a real blessing in this community. And I think we have a lot of fine people here and a good minister. I've heard a number of people say that they like Parish's messages.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pandemic has slowed us down, but then it slowed everybody down.
Yeah.
So, well,
things seem to be on the up and up. Things are. So that's
we'll hope
great.
that soon.
Yeah.
Soon we'll be able to get back and come every Sunday and not have to wear a mask. And be able to sing and.
Yeah. I think that's coming pretty soon. Well, Mrs. Tonnesen, thank you so much for being on our program today. If you enjoyed our interview, you the viewer, please like, share, comment. We want to keep the conversation going. Are there any stories that you remember about First Presbyterian? Are there stories you remember about Mrs. Tonnesen and her sister Catherine? Also, check back on our channel to find other episodes of FPC Talks, as well as our regular church services. We go live every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Currently, we are open for in-person worship, Mass required, but if you still feel like staying home, we have it live streamed. And if you're in another part of the world, you can watch that as well. Mrs. Tonnesen, may the Lord bless you and your loved ones. We sincerely appreciate you coming on to speak with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I've enjoyed it.
I have too. Thank you.